Hey everyone, I am Dr. Aaron Wheeler,
And I'm Dr. Matt Cook.
and this is Missio Pop, a podcast on popular missiology where two overeducated white dudes talk about all things in the culture of missions and God's hope for the world.
This first season, we're focusing on the task of contextualization, the way in which culture shapes and forms the way we share God's truth. We're so glad you're here.
Welcome back, everybody. Matt Cook, how are you?
I'm good, man. Beautiful weather here in West Tennessee. Wish I could be outside hitting a golf ball or something like that. But here
Wait
we
a
are.
minute. I'm just noticing on the reflection of your glasses. I love putting visual cues into an auditory medium. Do you have a window in your office?
I do. I have a big window in my office.
Man, for real?
Like
Like
double,
you can look at
double
birds
thing.
and stuff?
Yeah, like I'm looking out at this fits with contextualization. I'm looking at it like an American and Tennessee flag. I'm on the second floor, so like the flags are right out there.
Oh,
Yeah, I can see the weather. It's
man.
beautiful. The only thing though, it's
I'm
kind
so
of
happy for
sad,
you.
but it's sad when you look out there and you see a beautiful day like today, and here we are inside.
But I'm
Are
not
you in grade and paper season?
well, yeah,
I'm in
but
grade
I
and
have
paper
no
season.
compassion for you because I don't have a window.
Well, I'm
I'm
sorry.
in a cave here. I have to go outside to get my vitamin D for the day.
Well, at least you live in like a pretty part of the country, right? You're in the Ozark Mountains. I'm in the
I
flat
am
swampland
I am
of
not in
West
the Ozark
Tennessee.
Mountains.
You're
We just took that name for
really?
well, yeah, we are in the flat part of southwest Missouri. If you go south into Arkansas, you get some of the Ozark Mountains. If you go west and north and east, you get not west. If you go north and east, you get some of the mountains. But no, Joplin is not a I would put it on
Oh,
the same realm of West Tennessee as far as natural beauty goes, which means not bad, but not great either.
yeah, yeah. Okay. It's funny that I didn't even know where you lived.
Yeah.
So nice to meet you today. Nice to learn where you live.
Yeah, this is
Okay,
fun.
Joplin. Yeah, that's pretty flat. I just pulled it up
It
on a
is very
map.
flat. Yep.
But you are not far from the hills.
We are not far. Yeah, you 30 minutes you can get into some fun stuff.
Yeah, that's
That's
cool.
my description of Joplin is real close to good things. That's my description of Joplin, Missouri.
That's
So
fair.
we don't have good things, but we can get there without too much trouble.
For us, we got to go 2 hours to Nashville or an hour and a half to Memphis.
Yeah.
We're in the middle of nowhere. You should come visit someday.
I've been to Tennessee a couple times. But
Yeah.
yeah, no. I mean I drove through West Tennessee, I guess technically. So memorable. We are in episode 6 here today, talking about a two-parter. I don't know how to say that. I don't care. Uh, on the dangers of contextualization, because this is a somewhat dangerous topic. It makes people uncomfortable. We're taking good things and we're talking about how to mess with them, and that can create some issues. At the very beginning, first episode that we recorded many months ago, and we made World Cup references, and someone made fun of me for that today. Um, we talked about that the metaphor of contextualization is like a bridge, and bridges are dangerous because while bridges do hopefully safely take you from point A to point B, they have sides that you can fall off of. And so we kind of use that metaphor in saying contextualization is like a bridge, is that there's two cliffs you can fall off of. On one side is syncretism, where you contextualize too much and the truth has been lost in its desire to become relevant. And then on the other side, you have irrelevancy, which we'll use another word for here in a minute, which means you haven't contextualized enough or at all. And so today we're going to talk about that second one, irrelevancy. What is it? What's the problem? What's the issues? What are some ways that we face it? And I want to start off by saying, I mentioned this before, that it's funny when I work with people in theology, in church work, is in missionaries, that when we talk about contextualization, almost to the person, they're going to be afraid of syncretism. They're going to fear going too far in contextualizing, letting culture win the day over truth, um, making theological errors in your desire to make something helpful and relevant to the community that you're working with. And so syncretism becomes the boogeyman that we make sure we avoid at all costs. And the irony of that is that 90% of people I've ever worked with were not ever in any danger of syncretism. Their big problem was irrelevancy. Their big problem was a traditional mindset that I do what I've seen done. And so contextualization doesn't happen, and the things that they're trying to do are not making their mark. So we're starting with irrelevancy because honestly, I think it's the bigger problem and it's the bigger
Yeah,
issue, and it's the one we need to
I
tackle first.
agree. I was asked recently, I was on a I never done a podcast before. I was a guest on a podcast,
Look at
and
you.
it was a local church that had their own podcast, and they said, so what do you think the biggest problem facing churches of Christ is? And I wasn't prepared for it. It was one of those like end of the episode, we're going to throw some questions at you rapidly.
Those are the
And
worst.
it caught me off guard, and I think I caught them off guard because my answer was biggest problem, tradition. Like, I think that's, and I got a call like the next day from one of their elders, and I thought, oh boy, I'm in trouble. But really, like, it struck a chord with him. He was like, so what do you think? How do we fix this? So like for me, this is a huge issue in missions and in local churches, because while this is a podcast about missions, like the way we live on mission here in the United States, we do not live in a Christian culture. So American churches, to contextualize well, have to view themselves as mission churches.
Yeah.
And one of our biggest problems, of course, is irrelevancy. But I think as to why this is the bigger problem and the fear of going too far, I think we recognize that if we don't go too far, like if irrelevancy or traditionalism, oops, I threw the word out there.
No. We'll
like
get there. Don't worry.
I think with syncretism, it's a fear of going too far and disobeying God. With traditionalism, it's like, well, if we stay in our traditions, then it doesn't really hurt anything.
Right.
The problem with that is it does hurt people. It hurts people's ability to see the gospel. And so while it may not be rebellion against God by syncretizing, we are limiting the ability of people to hear and then accept the gospel. So
Yeah,
that's absolutely a pretty big problem.
Absolutely. I think you articulated that well, is that, yeah, syncretism seems like a much more damaging failure. When irrelevancy is the failure, honestly, at the end of the day, it's a failure to be like Christ. Christ is incarnation. He is coming from the Trinity to humanity, which we've mentioned is the ultimate example of contextualization, and irrelevancy is simply the failure to do that, the failure to be like Christ. And so it's a real big deal. Let's define some terms here. What do we mean by irrelevancy? What is this thing? The definition that I throw out is that at its simplest, it's just a failure to contextualize, or to think of it as a contextualization that just doesn't go far enough. So it's your halfway baked cake, which is not good for anybody. Nobody wants that. Nobody needs that thing. It needs time to cook and change and evolve and become what it is. And for whatever reason, it has just failed to do that. So ultimately, what the result is that the unchanging truth of God feels foreign. It feels confusing. It feels, to use the term, irrelevant. And ultimately, it's this idea that, like, to find Christ, I have to change in many, many unnecessary ways. I can no longer be myself and be like Jesus. And so I have to take on all these forms and do all these other things and become this other thing that has nothing to do with Christ himself. It just has to do with becoming like you. And so it's right. all these unnecessary barriers and roadblocks and problems in the way of coming to Jesus.
Yeah, and I love the way you couch that in terms of speaking of somebody from somebody else's perspective. I can't become a follower of Jesus. It's too foreign, but really it's on the missionary. It's on the person who is planting a church or sharing the gospel to do this. And we cause people to feel that way when we fail to do this, when we are guilty of irrelevance or traditionalism. And to me, I think there's a couple of root causes to this. One of the root causes is legalism, right? Where there's a way that I've always done things, and it may or may not be biblical, but I'm going to bind that on you. One definition I have of legalism that I think relates to this whole conversation is when we take our application of a Bible principle or command that doesn't give a clear application, and we judge others based on my application. And the simplest one would be, 1 Corinthians 6:19-20, our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, so glorify God in your body and spirit. Most of us would agree, okay, there's a biblical principle. We ought to glorify God with our bodies. It doesn't give any clear application. So every Christian has to say, okay, what's it going to look like? What's the behavior? Here's the value.
Right.
Glorify God with your body. What's the behavior? well, we have some freedom there to decide. But there have been people in our culture who said, okay, to get a tattoo would be to not glorify God and dishonor God in your body. Well, I think most of us from our generation would say, hold up a second. Are you perhaps creating a law or an application that Paul, is it okay for you to decide that you shouldn't get a tattoo? Yeah. If that violates your conscience and that's your way of honoring God, great. But when you take that tradition and force it on somebody else, now we've got a problem. Now that feels like a very American illustration of this, but this can carry over to other cultures. When I
Oh,
take
sure.
those behaviors that are taboo in our culture and then force them on people in other cultures, now I'm guilty of irrelevance or traditionalism.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's um, that goes back to what we've talked about last week, values and behavior. That to use that First Corinthians 6 passage, the value is honoring God with your body. That is a clear Christian value that we are taught directly in Scripture. But the behavior of how to live out that value is not described. And so, even if it was described, we would have to ask the question: was that a cultural behavior that Paul was teaching, or was that a universal behavior? That the values stay the same, but the behaviors are going to be different. And so, what does it mean to honor your body for Christ? That's going to look like a lot of different things and a lot of different people. And it's that division between what is the way versus what is a way. And
Yeah,
that's hard. That's hard.
it is. And I think it's easy to see like the extreme examples when we feel as if other people are being legalistic, but perhaps for some of our audience, like all of us would agree we should love our neighbors. It's a value of Christ. And so everybody's passionate about different things. I think that if I remember right, you're pretty passionate about human trafficking. Have you done some work in that field?
I have not. No,
Where in the
that's
world did
our
I get that?
that's our mutual friend.
Oh, that's right. Okay. So there's an example of,
Yeah.
for example,
I mean, I
somebody is
care about
all
it,
in on
but it's
that.
not. I can't
I
say it's been
do,
my life passion. Yes.
but I think we sometimes run into people, and our colleague, our friend is not this way, who they latch onto something like that. And if you don't have the same level of passion that I do, there must be something wrong with you.
Yeah.
What have we done there?
Yeah.
We've taken a value of Christ and we've applied it to a specific situation. And if you don't share my application, then I'm going to judge you. And so that's just a, I
I
don't know
mean, yeah,
how well that applies to
it's
traditionalism,
funny
but
thinking,
yeah.
of our audience and our context here, talking about the missions world and some of the unfortunate parts of missions culture is missionaries are that same way too. I remember distinctly being a Bible college student myself, and I'm at a school that specifically all we do is train people for ministry. Like that's our only thing. And so everyone who's a student here is at some level looking towards these kind of things. And so there becomes this culture of like, who's the best Bible college student? Well, the missionaries come in and they're like, because I'm going to go and suffer in some other part of the world, then I'm the holiest and I'm the best and I'm the most Christ-like. And if you don't also want to be a missionary, you're not as you clearly don't love Jesus as much.
Yeah. And this is even like fear of traditionalists causes missionaries to sometimes not contextualize. I may
Sure.
feel as if, okay, here's this thing I need to do to make the gospel make more sense to someone in another culture, but I'm afraid to do that because I'm afraid that my supporting churches will judge
Yeah.
me and accuse me of syncretism, even though I'm confident in what I've studied. This is just good contextualization. So we live in fear. Fear causes us not to contextualize because we're afraid people will judge us for not keeping their traditions.
Yeah, I mean, there's maybe a whole series of podcasts about newsletters that missionaries have to write, and the weird things that happen when we have to tell our supporters what we've been doing for the last 3 months, and the culture of keeping those checks coming. And yeah,
That's right.
absolutely, irrelevancy can be an issue here because I have to. These people have been supporting me financially, and I have to answer to them. And so if I, you know, have done something or said something or created something that doesn't fit in line with their tradition, I might suffer the consequences for it. And so
Mm-hmm.
we got a little tail wagging the dog kind of situations there. So
Yeah, no doubt.
we've called this irrelevancy. Well, it's time to bring up the other term, which is traditionalism. Um, I like that term because of the clarity in it. That we get stuck in traditions, we get stuck in all things. We're talking about church, evangelism, discipleship. That a choice that was made somewhere in the past about how to do this, how to take this value and put it into behavior, we get stuck with. and it almost becomes just as sacred as the biblical teaching itself. And I think the thing about it is that it's not necessarily that we've thought this stuff through. It's not that we have sat down and really, taken solid biblical hermeneutical principles and said, what is God leading us to in this place and in this time? Instead, it's more about just what feels right. It's
Yeah.
that this is comfortable and this is safe and this makes me
hmm
on some existential level feel good.
And it may have felt really good 25, 30 years ago when
Yeah.
somebody first came up with the evangelistic strategy or the discipleship method. But over time, it's well, over time it became more and more comfortable for people, and then it became just this thing that, like, this is the right way to do this. So you got the value.
Yeah.
Christians are called to share their faith. Okay, how are we going to do that? Somebody decides, here's the method to do this, and pretty soon it becomes not a method, it becomes the method.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't work in a given culture or a different era.
I want to throw out my theory on this. This isn't in our show notes. This is off the top of my head, and it's a visual theory, and we're going to try to translate it to a podcast. But you may have heard the stats that like the average church exists for about 80 years. That there's this season, there's a point of planting, and then like a bell curve, a point of growth, a point of stagnation, a point of decline, and then death. So that's the normal life cycle of churches. My theory is that what happens, the reason why that exists, the reason why there's a period of growth followed by a period of stagnation, followed by a period of decline, my theory is that the reason this occurs is because whatever happens in that season of growth, whatever strategy, whatever methodology, whatever worship style, whatever you want to call it, whatever happens in that season of growth becomes the right way to do things. Mm-hmm. Because we equate one with the other. The reason we grew was because we were doing these things. And so that becomes the right way to do it. And so we stick to those things even when they've passed their season, which leads to stagnation because we're not continuing to contextualize. We are getting into irrelevancy from our failure to contextualize. And then as we plateau and as we level off, when the controversy begins and infighting starts, and we try to get, maybe the answer is new leadership in place, and it becomes, let's just go back to doing things the way we've done them before. And that's going to just make the problem worse until we get to this decline and death. And so I think the normal life cycle of a church, that bell curve kind of story narrative that most churches go through, is at its heart about irrelevancy, about a failure to contextualize a traditionalism that is rooted in the fact that at this season we did it this way and it worked. Mm-hmm. So let's just keep doing it this way.
Yeah, I think that's great. And not only is it descriptive of micro situations like specific churches, but I think of entire movements.
Oh, yeah.
Or entire religious organizations or mission. So like missions worked really well in this era. And this was the thing that we did. And so now it's 50 years later, and we're still doing that thing because missions seemed more effective in a certain time period. And we assume it's because of that thing that we did.
Right.
Or an entire religious group, et cetera.
And it's
that's true, micro and macro.
And it's so dangerous because if you really think about it, what we are elevating is man-made strategies and ultimately man. We're saying that what humans can create and what we can come up with in our strategy sessions is what wins the day, not the cause of Christ, not the power of the Holy Spirit, not God's divine intervention and partnership with us. Instead, it's what we can create. That's the thing that does it. And so that's what we hold on to.
And you eliminate that thing that was created by an important person. Now you're dishonoring that person.
Especially if you start naming buildings after those people. Or, now we're getting spicy. Fun stuff. Traditionalism.
Yeah, so
irrelevancy.
It's kind of like, the reason we do this is similar to, like you said, parenting, right?
Yeah.
So we just go with what we're comfortable with and how we were raised. That's our automatic default, to go with what we always experienced.
Yeah, that's so much of traditionalism is just, like you said, it's that parenting thing that we talk about, that no matter whether you thought you were raised well or poorly, that you default to what you default to what you've experienced. It's I work with students all the time that say, I want to raise my children differently than I was raised. They come from broken home situations, bad environments, a mother or father who just was not a good example. And so they say, I want to do things differently. I want to break the cycle. I want to have a different future for my children. And it's like, that's great. And I love that desire and I love that passion, but you have to find a different model. You have to have a very clear, direct, different thing you're going to do. You can't just want to do it better. You can't just desire to be different. You have to have a plan, because otherwise you're going to default to exactly the way you were raised. I mean, I think both of us as parents have experienced, like we've experienced our own parents coming out of our mouths, and that's like,
Yeah.
oh wow, I didn't know that was going to happen. Um,
And we say we're not going to do it until the moment comes when you actually do want to kill your kids, which you assumed that moment would never come. And then it's there. It's like, okay, now I'm reacting in the ways that I didn't want to react.
right, because of those instincts. They're just so strong.
Yeah.
And so this happens to strategies. This happens to missions. This happens to churches. This happens to worship styles. It's just, we do what we know. We do what we've experienced. That just feels right.
Yeah. And as we've kind of, I think, hinted at all season long, if we don't contextualize, if we are irrelevant, if we just focus on tradition, churches that stay in that tradition lane will eventually struggle, and they'll eventually die.
Yeah.
You see it in mission churches that die after the missionary leaves because everything was centered around the missionary, and all of a sudden the missionary's gone. He was the center pole of the tent. And when you pull out that center pole, everything dies and he didn't contextualize, and all the traditions surround him. And you see it in American churches that haven't adapted. What is happening to American churches that stay with their traditions and don't adapt? They're literally dying and closing their doors. So that's why this matters.
Yeah.
You said that you listened to one of our episodes and we were pounding our fists and it was picking up. I'm going to pound my fist. If we don't do this, it's going to be bad. And I'll stop pounding my fist.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just, it's going to be bad. It is bad. We have to recognize that this is a real thing that we struggle with every day. Because I don't know how much controversy we want to get into in one episode, but I have some weird theories on how long a missionary should stay in one place, if I'm going to be real.
Ooh, I'd like to hear this.
I really don't think it's time to unpack that, but I find it super instructive that the Apostle Paul had this crazy idea of, I'm going to go somewhere where the gospel isn't. I'm going to preach it. People are going to respond. And then those people are going to get the same Holy Spirit that I have. And you know what? That's going to be enough. I'm going to get out of the way and let them run their church. And then I'm going to move on and do that somewhere else. Like, it's scandalous that Paul's missionary strategy was a matter of months when it came to the church planting game.
I mean, maximum 3 years, right?
Right.
If you go with the Ephesus thing.
It's crazy. He had this idea that, you know what, it's not about me and my skills and my sacrifices and my supporters.
It's
about the Holy Spirit. Crazy.
Imagine.
So it's all, yeah, I mean, yeah.
But we want to push back on that because there's all the reasons that we say it's different. Like the miraculous manifestation of the Spirit, or my favorite, and I think there's some legitimacy to it.
Different rules. Yeah.
Is that he's got longtime Jewish people to help him out, right? So like they've got a little bit of a foundation, but you're absolutely right. Yeah, that's interesting.
And it's just
causing controversy.
Well, I mean, part of the thing that opened my eyes to it was studying the history of the country that I was living and serving, where the explosion of the church in the country that I was in was because the missionaries left. Not on their own, not because they wanted to, not of their own volition, but because of the political environment. The missionaries were out, and then as soon as they got out, the church started to explode. And it was like, uh-oh, what does that mean? And that's not been the story of every country. That's not been the story of every place. But I think it's something that causes us to pause. And we'll get into this as we conclude some other things about leadership and who's in control and who makes choices and what that means to contextualization. Today's podcast is brought to you by Ozark Christian College. Many people want to make a lasting kingdom impact with their lives, but they're not sure where to start. At Ozark, the Master of Arts in Biblical Ministry will equip you for effective ministry rooted in Scripture. This degree is for people serving in a church, a nonprofit, or a parachurch organization. With a fully online 30-hour option, the Master of Arts in Biblical Ministry prepares you to answer the kingdom assignment God has for you. Learn more and apply for free at occ.edu/masters.
How are things going? I mean, really going for your church post-COVID? At Kindred Exchange, we hope your congregation is thriving, that your people are connected to each other, your community is connected to your people, and all of these people are reaching the world with overflowing love and gospel impact. We have a hunch, though, because we are also a part of churches, that perhaps things are a bit messier than this. Over the last decade, we experienced new critiques to evangelism and American Christianity in a plurality of ways. Then, a global pandemic cultivated a natural break for many to step away from the faith community they had always known. We want to be a part of what's next for you. With the Mission Audit Weekend at Kindred Exchange, you'll gather with leaders from area churches to ask the tough questions about what's past, what's next, and what's best for the gospel to be an encouragement not only to your immediate neighbors, but to your neighbors across the globe. Through keynotes, facilitated workshops, and curated moments of networking and sharing, our team of mission experts will guide your church leadership through a 2-day assessment of your outreach programs and strategies. It's no secret that people are hungry for good news. Let's make sure we're using relevant approaches to help that good news be received as hope and light in a heavy, fast-changing world. If your church would like to be a city host, let us know. Or you can sign up for our next event taking place in Nashville on August 25th and 26th at www.kindredexchange.org/audits.
Let's transition a bit to looking at what are some examples of irrelevancy. Like, let's get down to concrete things here. What does irrelevancy look like? How do we identify it? What are some examples that we would see both across the world and in our own backyard?
Yeah, so I'm super thankful for the pioneers of the modern mission movement who really did sacrifice, because it took them months to get where they were going.
Yeah,
and
they carried their clothes in their coffins. Yeah.
And their families died. I mean, just what they went through is beyond what any of us could imagine. But I think it's fair to say that traditionalism was prevalently practiced in the colonial era when missionaries carried a Western flavored form of Christianity to foreign cultures. And often it looked like they were trying to civilize and Christianize people rather than help them to come to know Jesus in their culture. And that's tough, but it's true.
It was that ethnocentrism we talked about last time. The superior mindset of the missionary movement of, we think we're bringing in something better, which is the gospel, but hopefully we've improved a little bit from, we're not only bringing the gospel, but we're bringing civilization and how to live and everything that's better to you poor people who have nothing on your own.
Yep. So you experienced this a little bit in Asia, right?
Yeah. We had a weird situation where we were living in a major city with a lot of foreign people. Just the nature of the city we were living in, the capital. You have a lot of people there for various reasons and for various endeavors because of the nature of the place. And so what this created was this thing called the International Church, which is its own fun, complicated thing. And so within the specific area that we're living in, there was a local international church that met in an office complex. There was a big like banquet room there where they could meet and do their stuff. And we went there within like our first couple of weeks in the country. Went to this international church because my wife knew the guy who like co-ran it. And so we get in there, walk into the church, and it was this out-of-body experience where like I am back in the Midwest of America, because it was just an American church that was run by Americans, that everything was done in English, that had your
in English, really?
Yeah, it had your host that gave announcements, and we had 3 songs, and there was a sermon, and then I don't remember if communion was involved in this one or not, but then offering, and then a closing song, and then we were dismissed. And it was like the thousands of miles that happened between them and here didn't exist.
Was this can you say what country this was in?
I don't think I'm supposed to, but
Okay, that's fine. So was this like a church building?
no, it was an office complex that had banquet rooms in the basement.
Okay. So they kept it like under the radar, except it just
No,
looked really
this
American.
was totally allowed and free and able to do because
Okay.
it was just foreigners. You had to show your
Yeah.
passport at the door.
Okay.
So local
So there
people weren't
wasn't
involved.
even locals couldn't even come.
No, weren't even allowed to.
Oh, well, but then, well, wait a second. Is that decent contextualization then?
Well,
If locals couldn't even come,
well, it was an international church in a major capital city. So you could have created this, I don't even know how to describe it, but a truly international church in which the
yeah,
fullness of the body of Christ around the world, because you had that clientele, you had that people there, you
right.
had that potential group.
It just looked American.
It was blatantly American. You had it was monolingual, it was monocultural. The leadership all looked and sounded the same. But within the congregation, there were probably 80% American, which makes sense because this is an American thing. Under the banner of international, might as well have called it an American church instead of an international church. Because and that was fine for me because it felt comfortable and it was good, and it was what I was used to, and it required zero adjustment on my part. But it just also felt like a missed opportunity. Like we could have brought in the church in all of its forms and all of its places and all of its traditions and blended it into something really beautiful. But that didn't happen. Then I had the opposite experience where I was traveling. Part of my job was supervising, and so I had to travel to other cities and to experience other things. And I was traveling to the city in the south of the country, and somebody that I was working with invited me to their church on Sunday. And so this is great. I get to experience another one. It's another one's called an international church. So I was expecting the same thing that I had experienced in my city. And I walk in and it's not. I walk in and I am one of like 3 white people because this is an African church. Again, called an international church, but it is an African church run by Africans, populated by Africans. Everything is done in French. I had to have someone kind of translate into English for me. And it was like nothing I've ever experienced before. And it was its own thing. They were singing songs I didn't know. Their traditions on how they did things were weird. And I was confused the whole time and didn't understand what was going on. It was a foreign thing, very clearly not for someone like me, but was its own form of the same thing, where a church in all of its tradition had just been copied and pasted from one place to another. And I got to see what that was like on the other side, where if I had lived in that city, I probably wouldn't have come back the next week because it required so much adjustment and clearly did not have my needs in mind. Not that church is about meeting my needs. That's not what I'm saying. But I clearly didn't matter as far as what the church was going to do. And so I got to see it from the other perspective and the other thing, and kind of, again, see the same kind of missed opportunity of a failure to contextualize the church and the body in its forms for the people that were there. But it was also a major city. It also could have been something else. It also had a lot of opportunities for other things, but it made a choice to be just one way.
That's fascinating. So my international experience is mostly in Latin America. And what I experienced there, especially with American missionaries, of course, there were local churches led by Latin Americans, of course, but you still had missionaries coming in and helping and planting churches, et cetera. And I saw, at least from my heritage, there was this tendency to lean toward either doing church based on my experience and preferences. So it's going to look a lot like the American church experience I grew up. And you go across Latin America, especially Latin American churches of Christ, and it looks nearly identical to an American church. And I kind of knock that a little bit, but as I think about the bigger, larger evangelical churches that I experienced at least in where I lived, it was the same thing. They were purely indigenous. They had Peruvian pastors, etc. But it still looked very much like an American megachurch, or an attempt at being an American megachurch. So there's that. Or what I experienced was American missionaries will sometimes rebel against the traditionalism that they experienced in their youth. Like, this is their chance to bust up out of that traditionalism. And so they plant the church in another culture, and really all that church is the way they wish it had been when they were young. It's not that it's not that it looks like the culture they're in.
Right.
It's just, I don't want it. I'm going to plant the church and I don't want it to be like what I had. For example, I had friends and they acknowledged this. When they came to Peru, they wanted to do house church and they had reasons for that. But they wanted it to be to rebel against the formal thing that they've experienced. They wanted to be really relaxed, really chill. The problem is, like when you go into a Peruvian's home, especially as you start a dinner or something like that, they're so super formal. Like it's the man of the house gets up and like gives this formal welcome. It's really, from my perspective, it's really awkward. And you go around and you greet every single person in the room. And when you leave, you say goodbye. You don't just sit on the couch and like chill out like you're watching a football game. It's far more formal. Which again kind of rubbed up against their idea of we want to be informal, because all we experienced growing up was formal. So that's one way that I saw like traditionalism in missionaries in this foreign context. But it happens here.
I think that's funny in those two examples you just gave. Whether it's a super formal or super informal house church, or whether it's a traditional evangelical megachurch, both of those situations, the leader wants the church in their image.
Yeah.
They both want it to be how I wish church would be, not what the local setting needs the church to be.
Yep, absolutely. But this happens here in the States too. So how have you seen this sort of traditionalism happen around here?
I mean, it's so everywhere all the time. It's hard to nail one specific thing, but one of them that's always troubled me is this this thing I've heard at a number of different churches in a number of different places. I have to be careful because there's a church in my community that hits this drum hard, and I want to be clear, I'm not talking about them. This is a much bigger thing that I've seen a lot of different places, which is this phrase that we're going to have a
wait, you're making assumptions that there's like this massive audience that's listening to us. So to the 6 people who are listening, we hope you're not from the church he's about to talk about.
Sure. Yes. Between your parents and my parents, I think we've got it covered. But one of the things that I hear a lot is that we want to be a church for the unchurched. And I get the motivation, the value behind that. And that's good that we want to be a church that's about reaching the lost. We want to have the kind of hospitality and openness and, in the Christ-like way to seek and save, that we want to be about, not just, being a comfortable place for Christians together. I'm all on board in favor of that. So that's not the issue. But a church for the unchurched just raises questions in my mind. Like, what does that mean? Like if you're going to talk about the unchurched, there's a lot of different kinds of unchurched. There could be like what I call, cultural Christians. They're people they were at some point a part of the church, maybe raised in it as a kid, and they've gotten out of the habit when they got into their teens and college years. So for a variety of reasons, they're not a part of the church, but there's a part of them that always kind of wanted to be, like they grew up there and they had good experiences and the church was a positive thing. And so there's a part of them that always kind of wants to go back and just never had the opportunity. This happens a lot with young families once they start having kids. It's like, we want some stability and we want some moral teachings. And so, if someone would invite us, we'd come. And a lot of our evangelism efforts are geared towards that. And that's one type of unchurched. That's kind of, your easy pickings there a little bit. So the unchurched could be that first group, the cultural Christians, but there's other unchurched groups out there. Like I think about, what are the people who are fully hostile to Christianity? They've had, some deeply negative, hurtful experience with Christian people or with religion, or, something along the line. What would the church look like for them? Or, the biggest religious growing group in America, what they call the nuns, people who are, atheistic or agnostic. They have many of them little to no religious experience whatsoever. People who would never understand what's happening inside of a church service. They, getting there and singing songs and, hearing about drinking blood and eating flesh and, every knee shall bow. That stuff is just gonna blow their doors off because they have nowhere to put these things. And so those are all unchurched. But when I see the church for the unchurched, it really doesn't look that different than a church. It's, maybe there's a higher production value in the worship. Maybe there's a little more emphasis to be, upbeat and positive and, have, things look a little nicer and be more polished. And then maybe the sermons are kind of geared towards beginner Christians, geared, a little further down the dial on that end. And that's pretty
Mhm.
much all I've ever seen. And so it's like, this just looks like church to me. It's got a little bit of a different flavor, but the forms and the functions and the traditions and the methodology are all the same. And so,
Yeah, which what you've described is, I think it's your precise. It's geared towards cultural Christians who don't go to church anymore,
right.
right? And maybe there's one of the nuns who comes along and is patient enough or has relationships with people enough that they make it through some of that stuff and then become followers of Jesus. But yeah, this is for those people who fell out of the habit a while back. Yeah, I
But
think you're
but I
onto something
find that
there.
there's this desire to like pat ourselves on the back for how we reinvented church. And it's like, that's just
Yeah.
not what I'm seeing. Is, the joke that I throw around is be like, the problem with all of this is McDonald's, and then you go off and invent Burger King. It's like, you haven't changed the game here. This is
Yeah.
not the thing you think it is.
Yeah, no doubt. For me, I kind of like the opposite side end of the spectrum is, I think the place where this shows up a lot in my circles is in the traditional rural or small town American church. Now, I'm not saying this can't happen in a big city church. What I think is the case is urban churches who have stayed very traditional, a lot of them are down to nothing, right? Or they have had to
Yeah.
close their doors. But the rural and small town American church, in some ways, is still thriving if it's done this a little bit. But especially I see it in the churches that just refuse to change at all. And so it's kind of like you walk into a church building, the entire experience from the time that you walk into the building feels as if you've stepped back in time 4 decades. I literally had a member at our church who went to visit their parents, and this is what they told me. They said they came back to our church and said it was like stepping back. They said 30. It was like stepping back in time 30 years. And most people would say that the church where I'm at is not. It has some traditional elements to it, obviously, but for a lot of these churches, they just haven't changed at all. So from my perspective and my experience in our heritage, that's a really significant problem. One example of this, and this may be totally foreign probably to our audience, but a lot of churches that still have like a yearly revival. In Churches of Christ, we call these gospel meetings. That phrase means nothing. Like, we advertise it. Yep. And it's changing. It's going away, thankfully. We want to preach the gospel, but a phrase that means, what a meeting, the average person drives by our church building. It's like, oh, a meeting, we're going to sit around a table and with coffee and talk about something boring, right? Except this boring thing we're going to talk about must be the gospel, because it's called a gospel meeting. And here's where this is relevant to missions. Like, I still hear American foreign mission campaign groups go to other cultures and they say, we're going there and we're having a gospel meeting.
Yikes.
In other cultures, yeah, like, it doesn't even make sense in our culture, much less we're carrying this thing that doesn't make sense in our culture into another culture. And so now it's like double jeopardy traditionalism or something. I don't know. I made that up on the spot.
Well, you're again, people can't see us. They don't know what's happening right now. Matt Cook got so passionate about this, he knocked over his own microphone. So this is a real big deal. But yeah, double layers and layers of, it's traditional inception. And it's a problem. So I think we need to talk about, like, so what do we do? How do we avoid this? What are some things that help us to
let's just complain about it for 45 minutes.
It's one of those podcasts. I think the first thing we got to do is, this is a little more of my personality speaking out here, but we need to question everything. I think with every behavior, I'm not talking about values, but I'm talking about the behavioral level of what it means to be followers of Jesus, whether that's our evangelism strategies, our discipleship strategies, the way we do church. We need to ask, like, why are we doing this thing? Are we doing this because this is a command from Scripture that Christians have to be about? Or is this a tradition that we've practiced? And so when it comes to church, when it comes to our ecclesial choices, these are pretty easy things to pick up on, such as the type of building that we're in, the architecture that it has, the meeting time, Sunday mornings versus Thursday nights, singing, lighting, sermons. Do we have to do any of this? Why or why not? My point is, make everything a choice. Make everything, we are doing this for this reason, not we're doing it because I guess that's what you're supposed to do, or we're doing it because it feels right, or because I like this. Like, it needs to be, everything needs to be a strategic choice. And I think that's something that we fail to recognize.
Yeah, I agree. And connected to what you're just saying, we got to ask, is this effective? Is this effective right now in our current context and in this culture? Obviously, our first, I mean, is it biblical? If it's biblical, we're going to do it, even if it feels ineffective. But we still can still ask: is the way we're doing this biblical thing effective? Does it make sense in our culture? So you say question everything. I'm going to add, yeah, let's question everything, but I'm going to be careful about questioning others' motives.
Sure.
Just because someone is stuck in traditions, I tend to be pretty judgmental, or at least like, come on, give me a break. Yeah. It doesn't mean they're bad. Doesn't mean their motives are bad. Just because someone does something differently than tradition doesn't mean that they hate the Bible, right?
Yeah.
They're just trying to be, even people who we would say they've fallen into syncretism, next episode, like that doesn't mean they're a bad person. They're just trying to make the gospel make sense. We need some more compassion and grace and patience. We need to demonstrate that to our fellow contextualizers, or even those people who have failed to contextualize.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because it reminded me of a situation that I was in. I was working in a local church ministry. I was having a contentious conversation with a person of an older generation about church strategy. And it just was a light bulb moment in the middle of this heated argument that, like, we want the same thing. Yeah. He and I are talking about strategies, but our desire in our heart is exactly the same, for people to come to faith in Jesus. And it's like, I had to figure out mid-conversation, how do we dial this back to our agreeing point, to the thing that we disagree on methodology. Our point was exactly what we're talking about today. I wanted to try new things. He wanted to go back to the way things used to be. And that's where we were having our contention point. But our heart and desire was exactly the same. Our motivations weren't wrong.
Yeah, that's great.
I think in this we have to know our Bible. I mean, that sounds oversimplistic, but we have to know our Bible so that we can know the difference between what is the non-negotiable part of following Jesus and what is just a traditional thing. We've got to know the difference between the two. Like we said before, the difference between the way and a way. Finding a way in your place and time is a good and wonderful thing. That's what contextualization is. You need to find a way that's helpful and relevant and speaks to people, but then don't hold on to that. Don't grasp it. Don't idolize it. I think that's probably the word we've been avoiding this whole time, is the traditions are often our idols. To say that a way has become the way and will always be the way, that's where irrelevancy starts. And so knowing the difference between what is a tradition that was probably a great tradition at one place in time, but recognizing that the time had passed and holding everything loosely, being ready and willing to let go.
Yeah, and I think sometimes this is going to get confrontational. This isn't just about throwing away traditions to become more relevant. I think sometimes there are traditions that people hold on to that perhaps are plain wrong, right? There may be pieces of our heritage, like racism or sexism or another culture's idolatry. Maybe you could even call some of those things syncretism, but they've been held on to so long that now they've become this tradition in a local place. And sometimes part of contextualizing is calling that out. And that's not fun, but it's important. I think another example of this would be American nationalism, right? That becomes this entrenched piece of a local church. Too spicy. Move on.
No. I was thinking as you were talking, I'm like, let's have some fun and name some things. What are these sin patterns that have become entwined with tradition that we need to talk about? Yeah, nationalism is definitely one of those.
Yeah.
Another one that I would name is power.
Yeah.
A desire to be powerful, to be influential. I think the baptized word for power is impact, that we want to make an impact. And so under that goal and ambition, we can grasp for power structures and our place and our influence in them. I think that's the sin pattern. I think Jesus talked a lot about power, and not in a good way. And we've lost that along the way.
And boy, I don't want to ask this question, but like 30 years from now, what are they going to say about us?
Sure.
What traditions are we establishing now that they would look back and say, boy, we had to fix this thing that they did 30 years ago?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't doubt that their big critique is going to be podcasts in general. That they're just going to be like, I can't believe all these dudes
they did
found some microphones and just listen to themselves talk. I'm sure. I have no doubt. They're going to come for the podcast. That's what it's going to be.
I don't blame them either.
To me, like when it comes to, this problem of irrelevancy, this failure to contextualize, that there's three big things that we've got to look at. There's what I would call language, appearance, and ownership. But those are the big three things that we have to question. Those are the three categories. So language means, we think of this as just a foreign missionary issue of like, you're going to another culture. What language are you going to speak? In the world of church planting, this is a big question of, do you speak in English because you're the person in charge and the one trained in how to preach well? So therefore you speak in English and then a translator gives the message to somebody else. Do you do that with a headphone? Do you do that with a live translator with also a microphone at the front of the stage? These are big questions that people have. But this is actually a domestic issue as well. You brought it up earlier when you talked about gospel meeting.
Yeah.
What the heck is that?
I think a church can still do the exact same thing and just rename it. Name it something that makes sense to people. That just doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I heard of a church one time that brought in people from the community that they knew had no connection to church. They brought in some nuns, not N-U-N nuns, N-O-N-E-S nuns, to walk through their church and said, what is confusing about this place? In our signage, in our parking structure, in how do you get from point A to point B? Like, what doesn't make any sense to you because these words are just foreign words? And it was a very enlightening process of the things that we just assume because we're insiders and we get this thing. We understand this culture, that our vocabulary is a big part of that. So it kind of comes down to, I think a question is like, where is your outreach as a church? You have to ask the question, is Sunday morning a place of outreach? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'm saying you as a church need to make that choice.
Yeah.
Because if your Sunday morning is a place of outreach, you're going to have to make some hard decisions about the language that you use, about how you describe things, about your vocabulary, about the types of songs you sing and what, imagery is involved in those, the place and role of communion, these kind of things that our language and our vocabulary and how we talk about things matters. The second one is appearance, representation, was kind of, what does it look like? When I show up to your church, what do I see? What do I experience? When I go to your outreach events, who comes to me? Some of this is, speaking of spicy issues, an issue of diversity. We're going to throw that word out. Careful, Matt. I think we just went woke.
Uh-oh.
I didn't say that word.
You said it. I didn't say it.
Yeah, it just came from somewhere. But what do people look like?
Yeah, no doubt.
Do I see myself here? Is this a place where I belong?
Socioeconomically as well. This is just about race. This is about like, do we all have clothes on that some people from our community could never afford?
Yep. What kind of cars do I see in the parking lot?
Oh yeah, no doubt. I'm in Tennessee, just a bunch of trucks, really.
Right. Well, no, that's the thing. Yeah. Being a Yankee from Detroit, that's weird for me to walk into a parking lot where they're all trucks. But this is also generations as well. Do I see my age represented? Or is, what does that tell me about this church? Either the church is a bunch of white-haired old men, or the opposite extreme, this church is a bunch of young 20-somethings, and my generation doesn't have a place. All of these things matter. And so it's not a racial issue alone, although race is a factor. We need to take it out of that category and say, in how your church and how it operates, how it visually represents itself, are you telling people this is a place for you? This is a place where you can be seen. I think those are good, relevant questions to ask.
Absolutely. Hey, how about one more? I think we're about out of time. I think the key here is leaders in any culture, any church can just ask this: how can we be a Christ-centered biblical church in this culture, whatever that culture is, right now? How can we be a Christ-centered biblical church right now? And then you don't ask the question one time, you keep asking it. Because if you don't ask this question, eventually these traditions will take hold, and then we take hold of them. And 20 years from now you're the church that's stuck in traditions, and somebody has to come along and either do a podcast about it, or somebody's got to do some good contextualization.
Yeah. I wish we had the opportunity to, do a post-mortem on Christian things, whether it's churches or organizations or missionary groups that have died out, to say, like, what were the steps that got to this place? What led to these things? I don't doubt that we would see traditionalism / irrelevancy as a core thread to all of this stuff, because those really are the stakes, and that's the level of things that we're talking about, and that's why these things matter.
No doubt. It was fun.
Yep. Next week we'll talk about syncretism and the opposite side of these things. What happens when contextualization goes too far? Looking forward to it, Matt.
Yep,
See you
it'll be
then.
fun. All right, see you, man.